Hi, so these notes are going to introduce you to the key structures and functions that are universally found in connective tissues. So let's go over this. So we're going to go over what the major features of connective tissues are today in today's notes. This is part 1 of 3 parts that review the connective tissues in depth. Today is the overview of connective tissue, and then the next part will go over what's called connective tissue proper. And finally, the last part will go over special forms of connective tissue known as fluid and supportive connective tissues. So, an introduction to connective tissues, which we kind of went over in the intro lecture, but just to remind ourselves what they are, is connective tissues are the most abundant and diverse tissues in the body. Their main jobs or functions is to support and protect, such as bone, do transport, such as transport gases, nutrients, waste, hormones, etc. through fluids like lymph or blood. They do also provide a lot of storage and insulation like fat. And they do provide defense, such as fighting off microorganisms like viruses and bacteria or cancer through your white blood cells. So these are all important roles of connective tissues. Not all the connective tissues are listed here, but they ultimately participate in this. All right. So, reminding you, this is epithelium above here, but the thing about connective tissue is it's underneath. It's always underneath. It's never exposed. It's always underneath a layer of epithelial tissue. And the basement membrane is a special type of connective tissue, just reminding you. But the key here is the additional connective tissue beneath the basement membrane is the connective tissue that holds lots and lots of stuff. And because connective tissue is not as tightly packed as epithelial, it's capable of holding lots of stuff like nerves, like blood vessels. So, therefore, because it's under the epithelial cells and because it's less densely packed, it's capable of being vascular, which is the term for meaning it has a blood supply, which it can provide food to itself and to the epithelial above it. The one exception is cartilage and tendons. Those, because they lack, they're the forms of connective tissue that's more dense than normal. And as a result, they actually lack as much blood supply, so they have a harder time repairing themselves. So if you rip a tendon or damage your cartilage, it has a hard time healing. And finally, because they have more space, you also have opportunity to put nerves in those things. So you feel more pain in the parts of your skin underneath the upper surface because, one, it has all the nerve endings, because it's mainly connective tissue in the layers of your skin that bleed. All right, so there are 3 big categories for connective tissues. 1 is connective tissue proper, 2 is fluid connective tissues, and 3 is supportive connective tissue. In terms of broad categories within connective tissue propers, we can divide them into loose versus dense. Loose connective tissues provide more of an open framework, which means lots more space for blood flow and nerve tissues for allowing connections and sensing stuff. On the other hand, dense tissues are used more for attachment and connection of stuff, but because they're densely packed, they're going to be a lot more like epithelial tissues in the fact that they don't have as much space between the tissues for stuff to weave through. Fluid tissues are tissues that are liquid, basically, at their main state. And there's 2 main kinds. There's blood and lymph. Blood is part of the cardiovascular system, and lymph is part of the lymphatic system. We're mainly going to go over blood, though. And finally, there's supporting connective tissues that help hold up your body and form protective shapes. So cartilage and bone are the main 2 there. And we're going to dive into each of these categories in the later lectures. So, B, what's in connective tissues? What's universally forms the structure of all those tissues? Connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supportive connective tissue. What do they all share in common? Well, the thing that makes a connective tissue is the fact that it consists of cells and a matrix. And that matrix has ground substances and fibers. So it consists of many cell types and fibers within a matrix containing a syrupy ground substance. There are two main components of connective tissues, and those two main components are cells and the matrix. So the cells are the living part of the connective tissue, and its whole job is to maintain the tissues and to actually form the matrix. The matrix itself, though, is what's between the cells that provides support and helps determine whether it's going to be solid or liquid, or whether it's going to be flexible or really stiff and hard to move, things like that. That's actually determined by the matrix itself. But the cells determine the matrix because they make it. So, cells can play a number of roles inside the connective tissues. So the most important cells are the fibroblasts. So the fibroblasts, fibro like fiber, and they form fibers that they dump on the outside of the cells to help lay down like kind of the ropey scaffolding that helps hold the connective tissue into its structure. Now, among these cells, you'll also often have white blood cells that are in the connective tissues that weave through the connective tissues to help fight off diseases and anything that might enter the connective tissues. There's not always a lot of white blood cells, but if there's opportunity, you're going to try to get some white blood cells into your connective tissue to help look for any diseases and stuff. And finally, some connective tissues have a lot of what we call adipocytes or adipocytes. And adipocytes are the cells that are just fat cells. Okay? And fat cells are cells that basically are filled with huge lakes of fat in a special vacuole organelle that helps allow it to hold lots and lots of lipids. And as a result, it provides a great layer to provide either insulin and cushioning or to provide energy if needed. So this is a classic kind of cartoony image of what connective tissues are. So all these strands here, these are fibers. And all the little bits in it are cells. So a mast cell and a macrophage and an eosinophil and neutrophil, these are all just special types of white blood cells. All right. This fibroblast, though, this dude is making the collagen, the collagen and elastic fibers that you see, the fiber band strings and stuff. So, and then fat cells. All right, but you're going to see more images of what they actually look like later on. Okay, a mast cell and plasma cell are special types of white blood cells, so I'm just going to preview it. But for those of you curious, if you have allergies, that's because you have potentially overactive mast cells, which help create the histamines that make you have inflammation. So that's why you take an antihistamine to reduce allergy reactions. Plasma cells make antibodies. And adipose, and this is kind of a gross picture, this is a surgical picture, is fat, and you find fat sitting right underneath your skin, and it makes really thick layers underneath your skin. But in terms of our class, these are the cells types that are all I'm looking for: fibroblasts, white blood cells, and adipocytes. Okay, now those are the cells that are found within the connective tissues, especially fibroblasts, but almost as important as the cells, maybe even more important than the cells, is the matrix. The matrix is the extracellular, the stuff that is found outside. So extracellular means extra beyond the cell, so outside the cell. And this stuff is what creates the shape and the structure of your connective tissue. And in fact, for example, your bones that survive after death, all the cells have died, but the matrix, the bony matrix of calcium is left behind and that's actually what you find in bones of fossils. It's just calcium at that point because all the cells in them have died off long ago. Okay, so the matrix is made of two parts, the fibers and the ground substance. So the ground substance can be liquid or it can be mineral. But what they do is they act as sort of like a glue that combines and holds together all the cells. If it's blood, plasma is sort of like a viscous glue. Kind of think of it as like almost cornstarch slurry. It's like a soup that holds everything together and lets them interact with one another. But when we're talking about bones, it's calcium that kind of cements the cells together. Fibers, though, are found in all of them, even blood. But blood just doesn't have as much fiber as, for example, your bones or your tendons. And what those are solid protein strands. And what they do is they strengthen and support your cells. In blood, they make the blood fluid itself a little bit thicker. But in your bones and your tendons, they're literally attaching things together all throughout and making them solid. So there's 3 main types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular. So we're going to go over those. So collagen are the biggest and most abundant, most commonly found types of fiber in the body, in connective tissues. Elastic, on the other hand, tends to be thinner, more filamentous fibers found throughout the body, while reticular is wavy and only really found in soft tissues to help kind of create the networking that's found to make soft, squishy tissues maintain their shape. So in terms of cartoon representation, then, a good way to represent collagen is to just kind of draw kind of ropey things. Because that's what they are. They're thicker ropes that kind of streak across with little cells that might be found in between those ropes. Elastic, on the other hand, tends to be thinner ropes, single-stranded ropes that kind of wave in random directions. Reticular, on the other hand, is usually very thin and hard to see. So usually, in order for your microscope to pick up on reticular, they have to use a special stain that turns that reticular strand super dark, like black or silver. And more than that, they look like elastic in that they're very thin. But one of the weird things about them is they tend to ripple a lot. So when you see reticular, they tend to look like that, like they wave all around. It's weird. And then there's cells between them, but they look like it looks like cracked glass, honestly, is what reticular strands look like. And usually you don't see them in the microscope unless you're specifically stained. So usually you'll never see reticular strands in a normal microscope, though you will see collagen and elastic unless it's tissue that's specifically stained to look for reticular fibers. Okay. So, this, for example, is a picture of reticular tissues. It's like, again, you cannot really see them unless you stain them super dark. This is a classic example of a tissue type called areolar. So those big, thick red bands are the collagen fibers, and those thin purple bands that are going across, that's elastic fibers. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. I'm not a huge fan of this cartoon image that I have up here, so if you just use the pictures I have on this slide, that'll help you kind of draw a quick sketch so that you can use that as a reference so you know what collagen and elastic look like relative to one another. All right, so that concludes the lecture. So our key takeaways here: connective tissues are the most abundant, commonly found, and diverse type of tissue class that's found in the body compared to your muscle tissues, your nervous tissues, and your epithelial tissues. And because they're so diverse, they undergo or they fulfill a diverse range of roles in the body. But ultimately, there's a few things that all connective tissues have in common. One, they're never the one that's closest to the surface, to the outside. There's always a layer of epithelium tissue between connective tissues and the outside. And in addition to that, unlike epithelial tissue, most connective tissue has more space in it, which allows it to hold blood vessels and nerves as needed. In addition to that, the main anatomical features that are found in connective tissue that makes it connective tissues is the abundance of a extracellular matrix that is just as important as the cells that are found in this tissue types. And the extracellular matrix, again, is made of fibers and ground substance. The matrix and the ground substance within it can be hard or liquid, and it's just as important for determining what type of tissues we're looking at. And the cells themselves, though, are really there to, they do have other roles, but a big role they have is to support and maintain the matrix between cells. Bones themselves are actually a little bit flexible when you're alive, but when a skeleton is a skeleton, when it's dead, there are no more living cells to maintain it, which actually means all the fibers kind of die off over time, and all that's left behind is the hard matrix, which then becomes really brittle and stuff like that. So, again, the cells are really there to help maintain the vitality and strength within that matrix of the body and the connective tissues in the body. All right, on that note, we're done with the notes. Move on to what else work you have for the day. Bye.